Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Scotland at 7. It's Monday, the 29th of March, and I'm Gordon Ross. Joining me this evening, our guests tonight are Simon Pia, journalist and broadcaster. So welcome to the programme, Simon.
Yeah, good evening.
Okay, glad it's nice to have you with us, Simon. And also joining me this evening is Toni Giugliano, who is the SNP's candidate in the upcoming election for Dumbarton. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having me. It's good to have two Scots-Italian names on the show tonight.
Well, we'll see how good the two of you are, Scots-Italians. Anyway, it's been a busy week in the news, but before we get to that, first of all, the coronavirus update for today. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,810,709 people in Scotland have now been tested through NH Scotland labs and the UK Government's regional testing centres since the beginning of the pandemic. Of these, 1,593,230 have been confirmed negative. 217,479 have tested positive. There are 352 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. Now, not everyone with the virus displays the symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 0 new reported deaths of people who tested positive today. The number of patients in Scotland who've now died from complications caused by coronavirus COVID-19 infections now stands at 7,584. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus within the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 259 were in hospital last night, 22 of whom were in intensive care. Now, as of 8 o'clock this morning, 2,409,826 people have now received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 326,263 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 126,615 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 23 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just in hospitals. Now to tonight's main headlines, and the SNP announced a doubling of the Scottish Child Payment. In her speech to the SNP Spring Conference today, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon vowed that ending child poverty would be a national mission statement for the next Scottish Parliament, and she announced that an SNP government would double the Scottish Child Payment. The SNP leader said that she was ready to put the case again to voters on whether Scotland should become an independent nation, insisting that independence was not a distraction from the country's recovery after the pandemic, but was essential to secure a recovery that is made here in Scotland and based on the values the majority of us subscribe to. Toni, let me talk to you first of all, as the member of the SNP and a potential candidate. Nicola Sturgeon's announced a doubling of the child payment. Now, this is a part of a long-term plan, isn't it? That's not just a one-off to woo the voters. This has been cooking for a while, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was kicked off in February with the initial Scottish Child Payment, and that's already having an impact with families signing up and more families doing so. And it's, I think, excellent news that we're seeing today the SNP is embarking on a radical policy agenda, I think, not just with the Scottish Child Payment, but also in wanting to boost free school meals and expand those, including breakfast clubs as well. And I think the policy platform that we're putting forward from an education perspective, I think, is particularly strong. Ending child poverty with the powers that we have, the limited powers that we have through devolution, has to be, in my view, a landmark ambition of the next Parliament, and that's what I think has been very clearly set out by the First Minister today. Scottish Child Payments will make a big difference to families in Dumbarton and the Vale of Leven and Helensburgh and Lomond, and the constituency that I'm fighting in this election. And I know for a fact that there are families that will benefit from resources, having had a decade of Tory austerity, having had a decade of Tories cutting welfare left, right and centre. Look at what we've seen with the universal credit uplift and their refusal to move in that direction. And more broadly speaking, a tale of two governments. a UK government that will punish the most vulnerable, the poorest in society, and a Scottish government that is putting the most vulnerable in our society at the heart of its agenda. That's a tale of two governments. And frankly, that's a choice that we have on the 6th of May. More austerity from the Tories or a progressive policy agenda by the SNP that will protect the most vulnerable in society.
Thank you very much, Tony. Simon, this is part of a broader policy with the SNP. Recently, Nicola Sturgeon announced that they wanted to include the United Nations rights of the child into Scottish legislation as well. And we know that the Conservatives' Scottish Minister, Alistair Jack, has tried to put a stop to that. Do you think there's any chance at all of that particular piece of legislation making it onto the statute books, or is it going to be a tussle between the newly elected Scottish Government and Alistair Jack?
Yeah, I think it'll definitely be a tussle. Who knows what the state of political warfare is going to be come May the 6th, or, a couple of days later when we've got the full results, especially if the SNP have done particularly well, if they get their overall majority. I think that only heighten the tension between the UK government and the Scottish government, and obviously that'll in many ways serve the Scottish government better than the Conservative government, the UK government down in London. But I think the announcement, I think what is we've seen in the last few days is the SNP doing what they do best, which is electioneering and campaigning. Because to think that they've been battered on the ropes for the last month, 6 weeks, or you can say even more than that, with the Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond, the Holyrood Committee, the media attacks on them, and then they come out the blocks with a 4% NHS pay rise, and then this announcement today. And these are two very strong points they've made, and they've set a strong agenda already, and we're only a couple of days into the campaign.
That's interesting. One of the things that's often said, Simon, is, particularly amongst independent supporters, is that Scottish law and British law, if you want to call it that, or UK law, are not the same thing. Does the Scottish Government, do you think, have the powers it needs to incorporate children's rights into legislation? Because at the moment, nobody really seems to be quite certain who's going to win that battle. Well, is it true? Is Scottish law as good as English law?
Well, it's interesting. I think we saw the Scottish courts and the way they behaved. And Joanna Sherry went to them regarding the prorogation of Parliament.
Indeed.
And the way they I think the Scottish legal system muscles, and anyone else who's listening in, I think there is a lot of sympathy in the upper echelons of the Scottish legal establishment, more than people would think, for the Scottish government. Okay. And I think that is a development that you would not have got 20 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago. But I'm not saying that but I think it's the length of time that the Scottish government, the SNP, have been in power, with all the other political developments, such as the referendum in 2014, the Brexit referendum in 2016. And I think there has been this cultural sway across civic Scotland. So I think, whereas 10 years ago you wouldn't necessarily think how much that the Scottish legal system would be in the Scottish government's corner, I think today it will be. It will be.
Okay. Well, listen, Simon, thanks for that. Tony, one final question before we leave this subject, and that was the idea that the Scottish Government is picking this particular subject, this particular topic of young people, of children, education, and lifting people out of poverty. Would you say there's been, I mean, the SNP has traditionally been criticised years ago for being too centrist and not being socialist enough. Do you feel there's been a little bit of a move towards the left of the political centre of gravity in the SNP in recent years?
Well, I think you just need to look at the focus on child poverty, the focus on attainment as well, and bridging the poverty-related attainment through the attainment fund, the PEF funding. So that's an example. The narrative around universal basic income
Yeah.
is another example. And I think you could argue that we have very much been embarking on this agenda, frankly, since Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister. I think there's been a shift, more so since Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister, on this agenda, and I think that's to be welcomed.
Do you think, Tony, that because we have a female First Minister, that there's more emphasis now on the problems which women face of bringing up children, trying to work, trying to keep a household, and all the time juggling the books to try and keep money coming in? It's very difficult, isn't it? Women traditionally have had a much tougher time. Do you feel that having a female First Minister has actually benefited Scotland and changed it for the better?
Well, you just need to look at some of the policies that have been introduced, even if you look at childcare, for example. When we came in 2007, we were looking at something like 600 hours of childcare. That has been taken up to, I think, 1,100, over 1,100 hours of childcare. So that's a clear example of the SNP wanting to help women get into the labour market and ensuring that they are competing in the labour market and are able to juggle family pressures and family life with being able to be in the world of work, and to be able to support families. So that's one example. Also, the funding that was announced for businesses, getting more women into business and breaking down the barriers. Funding was also announced recently with that regard. So there's been a whole host of policies that have demonstrated that the SNP is on the side of women and wanting to support women into the workplace and supporting Scottish families.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you both for your comments on that topic. We need to move on now. Now, the Scottish Greens and Labour are to focus on mental health. Mental health should be at the heart of Scotland's healthcare systems, the Scottish Greens have said. The Scottish Greens manifesto will include proposals to allocate 10% of frontline health spend to mental health by 2026, to invest an additional £161 million into child and adolescent mental health services, and expand access to remedies like cognitive behavioural therapy and social prescribing. The party also want more focus on preventative agenda and a mental health worker for every GP practice. Simon, on the face of it, this sounds like a pretty good idea from the Greens. They're obviously the parties are focusing on different areas of social policy at the moment. But this one, you would think is a bit of a no-brainer, really. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course it does. And everyone's so much more, the way that and Meghan Markle on Good Morning Britain, and within 24 hours he'd had to resign because, these disparaging people with the fact that the whole health system has sort of lagged behind in this, I would say it's more a case of investment and funds that are available.
Yeah.
But I think it's an obvious, a bit of a no-brainer, but be welcomed. And I've been particularly aware of it. I teach journalism at Edinburgh Napier University. The amount of stress, mental health issues has really risen in the last year due to COVID among students.
Yes.
And, we are seeking counters at the university stretched. But the idea that somebody knows that they can confidently go to their GP and get a specific mental worker is good news. Also, Labour were trying to claim it today as well.
Yes.
Sarr was claiming it was their idea.
Yeah, I think Labour also, as you say, mentioned this as well in an announcement today. Tony, come to you for a moment on this one. What do you make of this? The Greens are targeting mental health in a way that so far the Labour Party is trying to claim as well. Is this a seller? Do you think this is a vote winner?
Well, I mean, as you know, I work in mental health.
Yeah.
So for me, this is, I mean, I wouldn't describe it as a vote winner, but of course it is. It's an issue that affects us all and has been compounded by the pandemic. So the pandemic has very much exacerbated emotional distress, largely as a result of financial worries. So more people are out their income, their mortgage, whether they can keep a home over their heads, a roof over their head. That is going to exacerbate emotional distress and psychological distress. And the impact that the pandemic has had on children and young people in particular, should not be underestimated. So what we need to see, and the Scottish Government, as you know, has implemented or is implementing a mental health recovery plan. And you talked about CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy there. That's part of that plan. We need a rapid expansion of CBT. We need a rapid expansion of community-based support because, and I say this professionally, and I think I've been saying this for a long time, so I'm not going to stop saying it now just because I'm a candidate. But we do need to start investing in prevention.
Yes, this is mentioned in the story, actually.
Yeah, because mental health. We've been focusing on mental health services. We've been focusing on the S words, which is all about
coming in after the fact. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, supporting people once they're in crisis or beyond, and we actually need to equip people to support themselves and to ensure that communities are able to support one another earlier than that. So there's an element of self-care in that through schools and workplaces. So what are we doing to ensure that workplaces have well-being practices, looking at HR practices, looking at well-being agendas, making sure that you have policies such as not looking at emails beyond 10 o'clock at night, that kind of thing. Real practical examples of what you can do in a workplace to create mentally thriving workplaces. And similarly in our schools, ensuring that young people are able to identify their emotions, talk about their emotions, ask for help, introduce evidence-led mentoring schemes, peer-to-peer programs, before people reach crisis point. So that's where the discussion needs to be. Mental health services are crucial. They're important, and they will always be necessary. And people will always require them if they're at that stage of requiring mental health services. But the vast majority of us, the vast majority of the population, will require the tools to navigate life's ups and downs, and that doesn't always mean clinical support.
No.
I hope that I'm making the distinction clear.
Toni, let me ask you a question, mentioning the idea of preventative mental health. Now, one of the things you mentioned there was being able to find support when you need it. Most of us, I guess, if we are suffering from mental health problems, we don't really know who to phone, do we? Don't know where to go. There must be surely a better vector for finding the appropriate services at the right time, as you say, to prevent your mental health from deteriorating any further.
So NHS 24 these days, and for quite some time now, do include an option for mental health support. For example, you do have a lot of third sector work that goes on, and I think it's important to remember that we can't expect our NHS to do every aspect of health and prevention. Charities are doing a lot of good work in the third sector, do some fantastic work in that sphere. If you look at Samaritans and the work that they do, for example.
Yes.
When it comes to, I would agree that when it comes to, say, for example, CAMHS, we need a streamlined system whereby it is easier for GPs or teachers to be able to refer young people to specialist support. So there are things that need improvement, and I'm not going to sit here and always say that everything is working brilliantly. And I think that's
Nope.
The reason why political parties do well after such a long period of time. I think part of it is to recognise where the gaps exist and where we need to do better and make improvements. So there are improvements to be made in mental health. Of course there are. And I want to see those improvements. And if I'm elected on May the 6th, I would want to be a champion in public health and in mental health to be able to see some of those improvements to fruition. But there's no doubt that and I think this is really important, where we were 5 years ago, compare where we are now, even just 5 years ago on mental health. More and more people are talking about their mental health now than they were even just 5 years ago. The stigma is starting to crumble. As a result of that, services are being overwhelmed, particularly on top of the pandemic. The number of mental health support workers has reached record high, and we've put in record funding for mental health services. So there is a shift. There's also a shift towards prevention, slowly, but it is happening, and I think that's to be welcomed. It's absolutely to be welcomed.
Well, listen, Tony, we've run out of time on this item, but let's move on to the next. In politics now, the Independence for Scotland party are to stand down as more people defect to the Alba party. In a statement released this afternoon, the Independence for Scotland party would be standing down its candidates to narrow the field and make it easier for voters to choose which pro-independence party they vote for in the list vote at the upcoming Holyrood elections. Alex Salmond's Alba party is expected to be the main beneficiary from this move. Meanwhile, as further lower-rank SNP members defect to the new party announced by Alex Salmond at a press conference on Friday, the party's big announcement today was that they have signed up the former WBO super featherweight world champion boxer Alex Arthur as their latest big hitter candidate. And a terrible pun there, I'm sorry, Simon. But what do we make of this new party? Have you had a chance to consider what the Alba party might mean for the list vote, Simon?
Well, I actually, partly tongue-in-cheek, did this. I was actually being interviewed on Al Jazeera television, and they were asking me, it's after Alex Salmond was found not guilty and not proven on one charge, and they were saying, what is the future for him? And, I could obviously see this potential schism, but I suggested, who knows, you wouldn't put anything past Alex Salmond forming a breakaway party. Now, I would say just where it is at the moment and looking at polls, I don't think they will do particularly well. My initial reaction was pretty dismissive, but the way this list system works, and you never know, up in the northeast, Alex Salmond himself might win a list seat. But generally speaking, I don't think it will do particularly well. I think the reality is when you get outside the bubble of people who are in politics, political parties, political reporters in the media, Alex Salmond's status has plummeted throughout this whole process. Since, the allegations, etc. He was yesterday's man before any of this kicked off anyway, but it's all just been exacerbated. So, and I think, Kenny McCaskill, Neil Hanvey, Alex Arthur, how much, a heavy hitter.
A welterweight hitter.
He's a bit lightweight, because you like to write a lot of top names. An interesting thing, like for instance, would Joanna Cherry consider it? That would be substantial, but I wouldn't be overly bothered about it if I was in the SNP. In the Greens, you would be concerned to a certain degree about them potentially peeling off some of their list seats.
I think that was one of the areas that people were talking about the most, Simon. Toni, let me bring you into this conversation. Now, obviously, you've heard the news as well, and you know as much as we do about the Alpha Party. Do you think that the SNP views this as a threat, or is it something of a flash in the pan, do you think?
Well, look, as far as I'm concerned, the both votes SNP strategy is the most effective way of returning a pro-independence majority in the next Parliament, and that's what I've been encouraging supporters and voters to do. I mean, we live in a democracy, and anyone is entitled to start up any political party. And that's clearly what's happened here. Not entirely surprising, I would say. I wasn't shocked when I heard the news, so quite predictable. But look, the arithmetic lie. If you look at the results of 2011, the SNP won a majority because of both the constituency and the list.
Yes, the balancing system of the D'Hondt system and the second vote worked in their favour on that occasion.
Exactly. So that's what happened in 2011. And in 2016, the SNP lost its majority because more voters decided to vote for other political parties, smaller political parties, and it lost its majority as a result. So, I mean, so what I'm advocating as an SNP candidate very clearly is both votes SNP. I don't think that any of these small, I mean, the Greens, I'm taking the Greens out of this equation and out of this conversation, but all these other pro-indie parties that are emerging every other day.
Well, the pro-indie parties that were emerging, to be fair, have now merged with the ALBA party. So the Alliance for Independence and Independence for Scotland party both disappeared.
Yes, but the point is that ballot papers, postal ballots are out in 3 weeks.
Indeed.
And the idea that this political party is going to gain enough momentum and enough support to come anywhere close a list seat, frankly,
it's a big ask, isn't it? Well, I mean, a lot of people have said that Mr. Salmond has left it too late to do this. But again, we haven't seen any effect on the polls yet, and I don't suppose we will see any effect on the polls at least for another 10 days.
Well, there is one progressive pro-independence party that is large enough to be able to navigate this election and return a majority. Scottish Greens obviously are running, and I think that people will be looking at the work of the First Minister over the past year and the way that she has been navigating COVID-19, and will be returning her as First Minister, because, as she said today, politics is not a game. It's not a TV show. It's serious business. And I think people need to look very carefully about the decisions that they make. So, as I say, people are entitled to be starting up political parties, but ultimately, I think people will look at Nicola Sturgeon and realise that there's only one political leader amongst SNP voters and supporters, long-standing SNP voters and supporters, who's able to deliver a pro-independence majority.
Okay, thank you for that, Toni. Simon, one last question for you. Toni obviously is standing for the SNP and has to, give the party a line. You're standing outside of politics looking in, Simon, as a journalist and as an educator. Would you say that Mr. Salmond has timed this wrongly? Do you think he's left this too late? I mean, we've heard from Toni there saying that it's very late to be coming up with a new party.
I don't think he could really set that much of a timetable. He wanted to see what happened at the Holyrood Committee. I think he was still counting on the possibility of Nicola Sturgeon having to resign. But it's a vanity project, and if people who support independence seriously want to consider voting for Alex Salmond, he's obviously still got some part of a loyal following, but I would venture it is a lot less than he thinks it is. So, if you know, is it a wasted vote? I mean, there's other things you can do with it. The point, though, that I would say to Tony and anybody else is that the Scottish electorate has shown itself to be pretty sophisticated, and a lot of people don't like just voting for the same party twice. We have seen that side. I remember telling people that in the Labour Party, and they didn't believe me, but people would change their votes. People will not just vote. I mean, the hardcore supporters will, but a lot of people will give the SNP their constituency vote, and they will look to the list to see. And I think there was a bit of a shift towards the Greens.
There certainly was.
It'll be interesting. Yeah.
The Greens actually are still doing quite well in the polls, I think, Simon, and the SNP are supposedly on course for about 70 seats, which makes the list seats seem rather trivial.
Well, there's 56 of them, but I mean, it could be quite nip and tuck. But if I was in the SNP, which I'm not, if I was Tony, I'd be pretty pleased with how the last 10 days have gone, with James Hamilton report clearing Nicola Sturgeon, the vote in Parliament. And then I would go back again as a political commentator.
Nope, we seem to have lost the end of it.
Sturgeon also very well before the Holyrood Committee, but the 4%, it was proactive, it set an agenda, it gave a contrast with Westminster 4-1, and then coming up again here with the child poverty, doubling a payment. And that'll really appeal to a lot of the people that the SNP have won in the last decade who were traditional voters. And the SNP, I think, are clearly, we are citing a lot, so we'll feel that.
Okay, well, thank you both for your comments on
that.
Can
I just quickly, just one final point on
yes,
that.
Of course, Tony, by all means.
I really agree with what Simon has said. I think going back to the policy agenda, what is the policy agenda? Voters want, clearly our supporters will be voting for independence, but actually the majority of voters also want to have a very clear policy plan and a policy agenda.
Yes,
I don't think that in 3 weeks' time, a brand new political party before postal votes will land on people's doorsteps will have the ability to put forward a clear political plan. I mean, look at what happened to the independent group down south. The independent group had all these, 7, 10 MPs who, yes, for whatever passionate and principled reasons, decided to leave their respective parties, which, by the way, in that circumstance, I felt, it looked like, at least, that they were doing so for principled reasons. And where are they now? So they were unable to put together a policy platform because they were coming from all sides. And I think, it's not that different to what's happening here. If you look at the mishmash of people that are emerging, you need a policy platform to keep a party together and to have a clear vision and a clear strategy. That doesn't exist, and it's not going to happen. And I think, for me, voters will look at this and think, what's the best way to keep out the unionist parties on the list? Because that's what happened in 2016. Fewer people voted SNP on the list, and we got more unionist parties on the list. So that's the message. If you want fewer unionist parties on the list, it's both votes SNP.
Well, our next subject is obviously linked to this, and despite what we've been talking about with Alex Salmond's new party, Douglas Ross of the Conservatives is clearly rattled by this, because he is considering standing down candidates to help Labour and the Liberal Democrats to beat the SNP. The Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross has said that he will stand down candidates in May's Holyrood election in the hopes of defeating the SNP. Mr Ross made the unprecedented move after Labour and the Liberal Democrats rejected his calls for a pro-UK coalition after the ballot. The Tory leader warned that the new Alba party was gaming the system by attempting to win votes on the regional list. Mr Ross said that he would also consider a pro-UK tactical voting campaign, saying he was willing to discuss tactical voting to maximise the pro-UK vote in constituencies and to stop an SNP majority and to stop the nationalist threat. Now, let me come to you, Simon. What is Douglas Ross about entirely here? He thinks that if he does some kind of deal with the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats on the constituency, that he will be able to defeat the SNP. Is there any realistic chance that he could be right?
No, I would say not. I think the Tories have had their high watermark. They also had a more appealing leader at the time in that Ruth Davidson had a general, quite well received by the Scottish public in many ways. Her own cred has dropped a bit, but so has the Tory party. Brexit has really sunk in, and you've got Boris Johnson, and there's a particular antipathy, I think, in the Scottish electorate to Johnson's type of Toryism. So I think they're struggling. It shows that they're desperately clutching at straws. Labour have learned their lesson from 2015 after the Better Together in 2014, which many people did warn the Labour Party about at a time within the Labour Party not to go anywhere near the Tories with a barge pole. They seem to have learnt that lesson. And I just think they're flaying about. He might be concerned that possibly up in the northeast again. I think that is one area that Alba could possibly
it would be embarrassing, wouldn't it, Simon, if Douglas Ross didn't get elected and Alex Salmond was put in his place?
Yeah. I think that's not beyond the realms of possibility. I think it's not beyond the realms of possibility that Salmond could end up being the only, Alba's only list MSP. But I do not think that they will make the roads. But it's because of the unique demographics of the Northeast. He does obviously have more of a personal popularity hanging on there, and it's quite a conservative part of the country. So he could pull people who had drifted over to the Northeast. He could come back in. Also with the fish and Brexit. That again, Douglas Ross knows that support for the Tories is waning and what had become for them an unlikely stronghold.
Okay, Simon, thank you. Toni, what have you got to say about Douglas Ross and his attempts at joining hands with the Labour Party across the divide in Holyrood? Is it a realistic chance of any kind of deal?
Yeah, well, they've got a couple of days to do it because there's another deadline looming with regards to candidates and papers being lodged. So they're going to have to make up their minds. But I mean, this is the typical Better Together lot coming together again, and that people aren't daft as to what's happening. The Tories want to come across as the real unionist party here. And want to come across as trying to do everything that they can to defeat the SNP. And if Labour and the Lib Dems say, no, we're not up for that, then, the Tories are looking for a wee boost out of that. And they will once again present themselves as the only credible unionist party that can defeat the SNP. So I think that's what the strategy is there.
I see. Okay.
I think that's what the Tories do. I'm not convinced that that's going to work. I mean, if I were Labour, I would be looking very closely at this and maybe remembering what happened in 2014 when they worked hand in glove with the Tories in coalition and Better Together. And I think that Anas Sarwar will be thinking to himself, this is not such a good idea for the future. So I'm not expecting anything to materialise from that. But I know exactly why Douglas Ross is doing it. It's all about games and gimmicks for Douglas Ross. All that throughout the ministerial code investigation with James Hamilton and the constant, have you looked at the Tory Twitter account during those days? It was just Trumpian to the max.
Tony, sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there, Tony. We have to move on, I'm afraid. We're short on time, I'm afraid. So we're moving to our next story. I apologise for cutting across you. Okay, Dominic Raab is to visit Gibraltar to discuss a post-Brexit treaty. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, travelled to Gibraltar today for talks with the Chief Minister about securing a post-Brexit treaty with the European Union over the future of the enclave on Spain's southern tip. As a valued member of the UK family, we stand side by side with Gibraltar as we enter into the forthcoming negotiations with the EU on Gibraltar's future relationship, Raab said in a statement ahead of the talks with Gibraltar Chief Minister Fabian Picardo. We are committed to delivering a treaty which safeguards the UK's sovereignty in Gibraltar and supports the prosperity of both Gibraltar and the surrounding region. This sounds very familiar territory, doesn't it, Simon? The British government trying to hang on to another bit of territory, which is remote, to say the least.
If you were asked me to put a bet on what remains a part of Britain, Gibraltar or Scotland, I definitely would put my money on it. You know, I would put my money on it being Gibraltar lasting longer than Scotland. I mean, it's a unique, strange setup. It shouldn't really be. The Gibraltar scenario is bizarre in the 21st century, the last remnants of empire, and I think what is happening actually is what is happening to Britain, and is that it is finally coming to terms with the idea that it must ultimately throw off the shackles of its imperial age, which has lasted a lot longer in what you could call the political subconscious than a lot of people will admit to. And I think that's been shown recently in the reaction to slavery and pulling down statues. But as long as this little enclave remains there, you've got to also think, what do the people of Spain think of this, that still in 2020, 2021, that Gibraltar is still part of a British protectorate. And you'd also think that a British Prime Minister might one day stand up and say, probably if Jeremy Corbyn had got into power or become Prime Minister, he would have said, hey, it's all your Spain, but we have these little outposts, and most of them are tax havens as well, which have led to undermining social and economic or bolstering social and economic inequality right across the world.
Okay, Simon, I'm sorry, we kind of lost your sound signal there. Tony, briefly, if you would, what was your reaction to hearing that Dominic Raab was trying to come to a new arrangement with the EU over Gibraltar?
Well, I mean, where do you start? Brexit has been a disaster from the outset, and I think we're only really starting to feel the impact now. Our exports are down 65%. Our fishing industry has been decimated, unable to get their produce to Europe, and still a lot of question marks on a range of policy platforms around EU funding for farmers and support for fishermen. So, this is not good news for Scotland. Brexit is not good news for Scotland. It's not good news for Gibraltar. It's not good news for anybody. And people are starting to wonder, what was the point of this?
I think
what was the point of this?
Nobody really knows, do they, Tony? That's the problem.
Well, indeed. I mean, young people who are unable to benefit from the likes of Erasmus, for example, which I benefited from, the point here is that we were told that there will be more money in this country as a result of Brexit. I think that's a fundamental point that we need to keep hammering home. Yeah. That's what we were told, that Brexit would give us more money back from Brussels. That hasn't happened. Actually, research is suggesting that we're £4 billion worse off. So, where's the £350 million for the NHS? It's nowhere to be seen.
I'm sorry, that's a question we'll need to leave hanging in the air for the moment, I'm afraid, as we're running low on time. So we'll move on, I'm afraid, to our next topic. The United Nations is urging the UK to take the lead in helping poor countries to fund climate action. Boris Johnson's government must take the lead in giving poor countries access to the finance they need to tackle the climate crisis, to make vital climate talks a success, the UN's development chief has said. Ministers from around the world will meet virtually this week at a conference hosted by the UK to discuss the needs of developing nations struggling to cut their greenhouse gas emissions as their economies have been left reeling by the COVID pandemic. The UK will need the support of more than 130 developing countries to make a success of the COP26 UN Climate Summit to be hosted in Glasgow this November. But relationships with poor nations have been hit by the government's decision to slash overseas aid by billions of pounds. Achim Steiner, the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, urged governments to show the same will to tackle climate breakdown as they were showing with the recovery from the pandemic. Now, Toni, I'm going to come to you first of all this time. You didn't get very much time on the last question, but this makes perfect sense for Britain, which is hosting the COP26 in Glasgow this coming winter, to be at the forefront of helping the poorer countries to deal with climate crisis. And yet what we're seeing is a slashing of the foreign aid budget.
Yeah, I mean, we need to show leadership. That's what this is about. You know, we're hosting COP, and we need to make sure that we are showing leadership, not just in terms of what we're doing in Scotland and across the UK, but actually what we're willing to contribute internationally. So, we need to showcase what we've already done with our ambitious climate change targets, with our renewables agenda and clean energy. And that agenda must continue. But actually, the UK government has a responsibility here for countries to throw money at changing our economy and transforming our economy entirely. A lot of developing countries haven't had the chance to get to the stage where a lot of European countries are economically, socially, and yet we're asking of them to be able to also transform the way that they operate to be able to contribute to reduction in greenhouse gases. We need to help them do that. We need to assist them with that. We need to make sure that we are upping international aid, but also that we're working with developing countries and working right across the boards to support countries, and do so bilaterally, but also through interventions through the European Union, or we would have done through the European Union,
Yep.
And ensure that we're supporting developing countries to change their practices and ensure that they're also transitioning towards a green future.
Okay, thank you very much. Simon, I'm going to bring you in on the next subject, if you don't mind. We are running rather short on time this evening. So the next topic is the Suez Canal, which is to reopen after the Ever Given is refloated. Egypt's Suez Canal will reopen for shipping traffic in both directions this evening after the giant container ship, which had been blocking the busy waterway for almost a week, was refloated as more than 400 ships were waiting to pass through. The Suez Canal Authority's chairman, Osama Rabi, said that the channel was navigable after the 400-metre-long vessel Ever Given was freed undamaged earlier today. The authority informed shipping agencies that convoys of ships will resume running both ways through the canal from 7 p.m. The Ever Given had become jammed diagonally across the southern section of the canal in high winds early last Tuesday, halting traffic on the shortest shipping route between Europe and Asia. After dredging and excavation work over the weekend, rescue workers from SCA and a team from the Dutch firm Smit Salvage succeeded in partially refloating the ship. Live footage on a local television station showed the ship surrounded by tugboats moving slowly at about 1.5 knots in the centre of the canal. Simon, this is a remarkable story, isn't it? This is a story of something which is too big to fit through a small canal, isn't it?
Yeah. It's also actually, it's got a connection. Britain's imperial past, and you can almost say like Gibraltar, like the Suez Canal, and the fact that remember Britain invaded Egypt with the French in 1956, the Suez Crisis, because Nasser had the audacity to nationalise the canal, and since then I think it's quite an interesting story, Western interest that. Have a favourable Egyptian leader, and you see that with the present government and the way that the US and the UK supported over the military coup, essentially overturning the elections where the Islamic parties basically won. It also shows the fragility of our system, because if the canal had remained blocked, the impact on world trade would have been pretty major. I think with the COVID climate, and I think it shows that the world that we live in is a lot more fragile. And despite all the advancements in technology and burgeoning economies in the 1980s, 90s, early years of the 21st century, we shouldn't take these things for granted in life. People should focus more on for basics of any economy, any society. And I think that is partly, you could roll that into the argument about why independence for Scotland would be not just a good thing for Scotland, but a good thing for the British Isles and England as well.
Yeah. Well, listen, Tony, I'd like to bring you in on our next story, if I may. So if you just hang on for a moment, we'll get to that. Now, Historic Environment Scotland sets out its plans to reopen its properties today. Scotland's biggest operator of visitor attractions, Historic Environment Scotland, set out its plans for the reopening of its sites as COVID restrictions ease. HES is adopting a phased approach to reopen its properties, with over 70% of its free-to-access and ticketed properties reopening on Friday the 30th of April, following the Scottish Government's proposed dates for the reopening of tourism sector and mainland Scotland moving to COVID protection level 3. This will see some of Scotland's most iconic heritage sites, including Edinburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, Fort George and Carlaverock Castle, reopening to the public in line with Scottish Government guidelines. The approach to reopening has taken into consideration the requirements of each site as well as the regional picture to ensure that, as much as possible, HES reopening plans appropriately consider the circumstances in each local area, whilst providing a diverse range of experiences for visitors to enjoy. As part of the reopening, visitors, including members, will be required to pre-book tickets online and to use contactless payment where possible. One-way systems will be implemented in some locations, and in some areas of sites, such as enclosed spaces, will be closed off to visitors. Visitor numbers will also be limited for safety reasons. So, Tony, this is a good news story. HES is planning to reopen our tourist attractions, something which I'm sure thousands of people in the tourism industry in Scotland must be delighted about.
Well, absolutely. Our tourism industry has suffered disproportionately as a result of COVID-19, and actually, this story is, in reality, demonstrating the huge efforts that we've made as a country to come through lockdown, and we're coming through lockdown, and restrictions are gradually easing, and this is a result of the hard work that we've all undertaken over the past few months, and people will be absolutely delighted to get out and about, to be able to rediscover hobbies and cultural landmarks, and be able to hopefully soon travel beyond the local authorities as well. So this is huge news, actually, for all of us, that we're very soon going to be able to undertake new activities and have a bit more normality coming back into our lives. We're all craving that, but I would say it's still important to not let our guard down too much, because whilst a lot of us are being vaccinated and the vaccination program is doing exceptionally well, we're not all there yet, and I think when people start to see these headlines that things are starting to reopen and that normality is starting to come back gradually, I think people can sometimes let their guard down a little bit, and we've seen what that can do in other parts of Europe. So I think it's still important to follow the rules and the guidelines as much as possible, and even when restrictions ease, continue to be washing our hands, wearing our face masks and socially distance.
Okay, Tony, thank you for that. Down to our final story this evening. Oh, I beg your pardon. Simon, I beg your pardon. We've just decided there's not quite enough time for this last story. But most of us in Scotland, myself and my family included, I think, in this, are very fond of what we used to call castling, where we could go, for a weekend or go for a day out and go to some of these historic monuments and actually get into them and see them again. It's something which I think we've all missed for the last year, isn't it?
Are you asking me that? Yeah, sorry.
What was that? I was asking Tony, but I think I was possibly the wide shot was confusing Simon. But Simon, of course, we'll let you speak.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon.
Coming out of COVID, and this is probably going against the grain a bit. I quite appreciated the idea that COVID makes us think twice about tourism. Edinburgh, my own city, I don't like what has happened to it with tourism. More Airbnbs than, virtually, I think, even per head of population in places like Barcelona and Amsterdam. I would like to think, as we're going forward, that we aren't just so dependent on tourists, travelled less, and let's look at it more as Scots enjoying their own country a lot more, rather than having to jump on a flight to Prague or Croatia or Benidorm, you name it, these budget airlines. So that's my tuppence worth. Let's think again about tourism, stay local, protect the environment, There's a green message for you.
Okay, it's what people in Glasgow used to call a Hamel-Damey holiday, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, gentlemen, thank you both for your excellent contributions this evening. We have finally run out of time this evening, but it remains for me to remind you that, of course, we're in the middle of a major crowdfunder here at Broadcasting Scotland. So if you'd like to help us by becoming a regular monthly subscriber, or if you'd like to make an individual donation or even volunteer, you can do that by going to our website. The details are on your screen now. But that's it from me tonight. Just remains for me to thank both Simon Pia and Toni Giugliano for being my guest this evening, and we'll see you again tomorrow night. But from all of us here at Broadcasting Scotland, very good evening to you.
Thank you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.